The urgent meetings in the Chernobyl control room, and later in emergency bunkers in Moscow, were fraught with a terrifying mix of scientific dread and bureaucratic desperation. The world watched, unaware of the deeper, existential crisis unfolding within the Soviet leadership. Academician Valeri Bezpalov, one of the leading Soviet nuclear scientists, presented the horrifying scenario. The molten core, the water pools, the inevitable steam explosion. His words painted a vivid, chilling picture of a disaster that would dwarf the initial blast, making the existing catastrophe seem like a minor incident. The implications were clear. Someone had to go down. Someone had to descend into the irradiated water beneath the reactor to open those sluice gates. The mission was suicide, pure and simple. There was no guarantee of survival, only a certainty of absorbing a lethal dose of radiation. The call went out for volunteers. It was a moment that would define heroism, a quiet, almost anonymous act of self-sacrifice that stood in stark contrast to the global political tensions of the Cold War. These were not soldiers charging into battle with guns, but engineers walking calmly towards an invisible, insidious enemy. 3 men stepped forward. Alexei Ananenko, 47, a senior engineer at the Chernobyl plant. He knew the layout of the facility intimately, specifically the complex network of pipes and valves beneath the reactors. He was a family man with a wife and a young son, but his sense of duty and his understanding of the stakes was paramount. He possessed the crucial knowledge of the valve locations. Valeri Bezpalov, 41, another shift supervisor from the plant. He, too, understood the plant's intricate systems, the blueprints etched in his mind. He was meticulous, calm, and utterly committed. His expertise was invaluable for navigating the labyrinthine corridors. Boris Baranov, 46, a shift supervisor. He was the most senior of the 3, experienced and steady. His role was crucial in guiding the team, ensuring they kept their bearings in the disorienting, debris-filled darkness. His presence instilled a quiet confidence in the younger men. These were ordinary men, fathers, husbands, colleagues. Not soldiers, not superheroes in capes. But in that moment, they embodied a courage that transcended all understanding. They knew the risks. They understood the science. They knew what they were walking into. Their decision was a conscious, deliberate choice to place the lives of millions, the fate of a continent, above their own. They were given rudimentary protection, wetsuits to protect against the contaminated water, lead vests for some minimal shielding against gamma radiation, though largely ineffective against the immense doses they would face, and simple flashlights to cut through the oppressive darkness. Their only tools were their knowledge, their courage, and their bare hands. Before they departed, they were briefly informed about the extreme radiation levels they would encounter. They were told that the water itself was highly radioactive, that the air would be thick with radioactive aerosols, and that the walls and debris would be hot with gamma radiation. Each step was a gamble, each breath a potential dose. Their mission was simple in its execution: find the valves, open them, but terrifying in its implications. Their lives, they understood, were already forfeit. The stage for their desperate mission was set. The 3 divers, Ananenko, Bezpalov, and Baranov, stood at the edge of the abyss, the shattered, smoking remnants of Reactor 4 looming above them, a hellish monument to catastrophe. The air was thick with the metallic taste of radiation, a silent, unseen poison. Their entry point was through a partially collapsed section of the reactor building, leading down into the subterranean levels. The path was treacherous, choked with debris, twisted metal, and broken concrete. Every step was a risk, not just from the invisible killer, but from collapsing structures. They descended into suffocating darkness, their only illumination the narrow beams of their flashlights. These were not powerful spotlights, but standard industrial lamps, barely cutting through the thick, irradiated air. The sound of their breathing was magnified, a stark contrast to the eerie silence that pervaded the irradiated depths. There was no hum of machinery, only the faint, distant echo of rushing water and the terrifying, relentless click-click-click of their personal dosimeters, steadily increasing in frequency, a chilling counterpoint to their pounding heartbeats. As they went deeper, the heat became oppressive. The molten core, just feet above them, radiated an infernal warmth, turning the air into a suffocating blanket. The atmosphere was heavy, humid, and thick with radioactive aerosols. Each breath was a conscious act of courage. The most terrifying aspect, however, was the water. The deeper they went, the more the flooded corridors and pools enveloped them. This was not ordinary water. It was a viscous radioactive cocktail, a byproduct of the failed cooling systems and the relentless firefighting efforts. It glowed faintly in the beams of their flashlights, an unnatural, phosphorescent green, revealing its deadly nature. They waded through it, sometimes chest deep, their thin wetsuits offering minimal protection. The sensation of the cold, deadly liquid seeping through minor tears in their suits, touching their skin, must have been a profoundly unsettling experience. Ananenko, with his intimate knowledge of the plant's blueprints, led the way. He navigated by memory, his mental map of the labyrinthine passages guiding them through the debris-filled darkness. Bezpalov, focused and methodical, followed closely, ready to assist. Baranov, the most senior, kept watch, ensuring their path was clear, listening for any signs of structural collapse, and, most importantly, keeping track of their radiation dosimeters, which were now clicking frantically, their needles spiking into dangerous red zones. Their mission was clear: find the two crucial sluice gates, located in a remote valve room, and open them manually. These gates controlled the outflow of the contaminated water. The journey to reach them was a gauntlet of lethal radiation, unseen obstacles, and the constant crushing knowledge that the molten core was slowly, inexorably, melting its way towards them. Every second counted. Every minute spent in this hellish environment was a minute closer to irreversible cellular damage. Their bodies were screaming warnings, but their minds were focused on one singular, desperate task. The journey through the irradiated catacombs beneath Reactor 4 was a terrifying gauntlet. Every step was a battle against the unseen enemy, against their own mounting fear, against the crushing reality of their situation. The readings on their dosimeters were now beyond alarming, spiking to levels that meant certain, irreversible cellular damage. The clicks had merged into a continuous, deafening buzz. Finally, after what felt like an eternity but was perhaps only 20 to 30 minutes of excruciating descent and navigation, they reached the valve room. It was not a grand, easily accessible chamber. It was a small, cramped space, partially submerged in the lethal glowing water, cluttered with pipes, conduits, and fallen debris. The air here was even hotter, heavier, and thick with a metallic tang of ionizing radiation. The flashlights cut through a swirling haze of steam and dust, revealing the grim reality of their task. The sluice gates were not simple levers. They were massive, industrial-grade valves, designed for powerful water flow, requiring significant physical force to operate. And they were partially submerged, their mechanisms stiff and resistant from disuse and the surrounding debris. Ananenko, recognizing the precise valves from his memory of the blueprints, approached the first one. He plunged his gloved hands into the viscous radioactive water, feeling for the cold, corroded metal of the valve wheel. His movements were precise, methodical, almost robotic, a testament to his training and his unwavering focus. He began to turn it. It was impossibly stiff. Years of disuse, coupled with the warping effects of the heat and the impact of the initial explosions, had jammed the mechanism. He strained, his muscles burning, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Every ounce of his strength was focused on that single, recalcitrant wheel. He knew that if they failed, millions would pay the price. Bezpalov and Baranov moved to assist him, bracing themselves against the walls, offering what little leverage they could. The three men worked in agonizing silence, their faces grim, their bodies pushing against the unyielding metal. The radiation levels were now peaking, their bodies absorbing doses that would cause catastrophic damage, even without immediate symptoms. Every moment spent in that room was stripping away a piece of their future, stealing their very essence. Finally, with a tremendous, almost audible groan of metal, the first valve began to turn. Slowly, painstakingly, it gave way. Ananenko, ignoring the searing pain in his muscles, the burning sensation in his lungs, continued to twist, the water churning around his arms. Then, a low, guttural rumble began. The sound of millions of gallons of water, under immense pressure, rushing out of the pools beneath Reactor 4, flowing through the newly opened sluice gate, emptying into a containment basin. It was the sound of salvation. They moved to the second valve. It too was stiff, equally resistant. But the success of the first gave them renewed, desperate strength. They attacked it with the same grim determination, the same selfless focus. Again, the struggle. Again, the groan of tortured metal. And again, the glorious life-saving roar of rushing water. The mission was a success. The main water pools beneath Reactor 4 were now draining. The immediate threat of the second catastrophic steam explosion, the one that could have ravaged Europe, was averted. Exhausted, their bodies radiating with an insidious energy, the three men began their torturous ascent. The journey back was as perilous as the descent, now made even more difficult by their profound fatigue and the crushing knowledge of the doses they had absorbed. They had completed their one-way mission. They had saved countless lives, but at an unspeakable cost to their own. The three men, having completed their impossible mission, began their slow, arduous climb back towards the surface. Their bodies, now infused with the invisible killer, were screaming. Every muscle ached, every breath felt heavy, and a profound bone-deep fatigue began to set in. The heat was still oppressive, the darkness still disorienting, and the frantic clicking of their dosimeters, though perhaps slightly less frenzied now that the immediate hot spot of the valve room was behind them, was a constant, chilling reminder of their sacrifice. They emerged from the darkness of the subterranean labyrinth into the gray, dust-filled daylight of the surface, looking like ghosts. Their faces were ashen, their eyes sunken, but in them burned a quiet, profound triumph. They were met by anxiously waiting emergency crews, scientists, and military personnel. There were no cheers, no grand fanfare, just quiet relief, stunned awe, and a deep, unspoken respect. Everyone understood the magnitude of what these three men had just done. Their bodies, however, had already paid the price. They were immediately rushed to a medical facility for preliminary examinations. Their dosimeters confirmed the terrible truth. They had absorbed lethal doses of radiation. The exact numbers are subject to some debate and varied according to different reports, but the consensus was clear: hundreds of rems, far exceeding what the human body can withstand. For context, a dose of 400 rems is considered lethal to 50% of people exposed. These men had absorbed doses far higher. The immediate symptoms of acute radiation sickness began to manifest: nausea, vomiting, extreme fatigue, skin burns. But their minds remained clear, their sense of accomplishment profound. They knew they had bought precious time, not just for the cleanup crews, but for an entire continent. They were quiet heroes, their names spoken with reverence by those who knew their story. In the days and weeks that followed, the water beneath Reactor 4 continued to drain, and then a desperate new phase of the crisis began. The liquidators were deployed. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers, miners, and civilian workers were mobilized to clean up the disaster zone. They worked to build a massive concrete sarcophagus over the ruined reactor, to bury the deadly elephant's foot, and to decontaminate the surrounding 30-kilometer exclusion zone. Many of these liquidators also absorbed debilitating, often fatal, doses of radiation. Their story's another chapter in the quiet heroism of Chernobyl. But their work was only possible because of the mission of Ananenko, Bezpalov, and Baranov. The molten core, now unimpeded by the water, continued its slow melt through the concrete. It eventually solidified, forming the infamous elephant's foot, a towering, vitrified mass of solidified nuclear fuel and melted concrete. It was still lethally radioactive, but critically, it had not caused the second steam explosion. The immediate, apocalyptic threat to Europe had been averted. The three Chernobyl divers, Alexei Ananenko, Valeri Bezpalov, and Boris Baranov, were rushed to the specialized Clinic Number 6 in Moscow, the leading Soviet hospital for radiation poisoning. They were joined there by many of the firefighters and plant workers who had been exposed in the initial hours of the disaster. These were the frontline soldiers in a new kind of war, against an invisible, insidious enemy. Initially, Soviet officials propagated a narrative that the divers had perished almost immediately after their mission. This fueled the dramatic story of suicide divers, whose bodies were never recovered, leaving a powerful, if tragic, legend. However, decades later, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, more accurate information emerged, revealing the true, equally heroic, but less mythological, fate of these men. Alexei Ananenko and Valeri Bezpalov did indeed succumb to acute radiation sickness, but not immediately. They fought bravely for weeks, enduring unimaginable pain and suffering as their bodies slowly failed. Their bone marrow was destroyed, their internal organs ravaged, their skin peeling from radiation burns. They died approximately 2 to 3 weeks after their mission, their bodies ravaged by the invisible killer they had faced. They were buried in lead-lined coffins, sealed with concrete, in Moscow's Matinsko Cemetery, along with many other victims of Chernobyl. Their graves are marked, a quiet testament to their sacrifice. Boris Baranov, the most senior of the three, actually lived much longer. He continued to work at the Chernobyl plant in various roles after the disaster, always aware of his compromised health. He lived for another 23 years, eventually succumbing to heart failure in 2005. While his cause of death wasn't directly attributed to radiation poisoning on his death certificate, the chronic health issues he faced were undoubtedly a long-term consequence of his exposure. He too is buried in Matinsko Cemetery, his survival a testament to the varying effects of radiation exposure, but his heroism no less profound. Their mission was deliberately downplayed by Soviet authorities, initially, to avoid panic and to control the narrative of the disaster. But their story gradually filtered out, first through whispers and then through books, documentaries, and eventually popular culture. They became known as the Chernobyl Divers, or Chernobyl Suicide Squad, their legend growing with each retelling. The names of Alexei Ananenko, Valeri Bezpalov, and Boris Baranov are now etched into the annals of history, symbols of ultimate self-sacrifice in the face of an unprecedented global threat. They did not wear military uniforms, nor did they wield weapons. They were engineers, armed with knowledge and profound courage, who stared into the abyss of a nuclear catastrophe and unflinchingly chose to step into it for the sake of millions of lives. As the water beneath Reactor 4 finally drained, the molten corium, the elephant's foot, continued its terrifying descent. It eventually breached the concrete floor of the reactor building, flowing into the lower levels, but crucially, it did not encounter large volumes of water. Instead, it slowly solidified, cooling into a grotesque, glassy, black mass. This elephant's foot became a chilling, almost mythical symbol of the Chernobyl disaster. Located in the steam distribution corridor, room 217/2, it was an amorphous, wrinkled blob of vitrified nuclear fuel, graphite, and melted concrete, radiating a hellish glow even years later. It was, and remains, one of the most dangerous radioactive objects on Earth. Even a brief exposure to the elephant's foot was, and still is, lethal. In 1986, just 30 seconds of exposure would deliver a fatal dose of radiation, causing acute radiation sickness and death within days. A few minutes would lead to unimaginable suffering and a drawn-out demise. Scientists and liquidators who later managed to photograph it had to use elaborate remote-controlled cameras or wear heavy lead shielding, exposing themselves for mere seconds. The iconic blurry photos of the elephant's foot, a swirling, monstrous shape, stand as a stark, terrifying monument to the power unleashed at Chernobyl. The existence of the elephant's foot, and the fact that it did not trigger a second explosion, is the ultimate proof of the success of the divers' mission. Without their brave, selfless act, that molten mass would have met its watery grave, unleashing an apocalypse far greater than what actually transpired. Their heroism saved countless lives and prevented a catastrophic continental disaster. The long-term cleanup of Chernobyl continues to this day. The initial sarcophagus, built over Reactor 4, was a hasty, temporary solution. Decades later, a massive, state-of-the-art new safe confinement, NSC, arch was built and slid over the old sarcophagus, designed to contain the remaining radioactive materials for at least 100 years. The exclusion zone around the plant remains uninhabitable for humans, though nature has begun to reclaim parts of it. But the story of Chernobyl is more than just a scientific disaster or a cleanup effort. It is a profound human story of sacrifice, resilience, and the quiet courage of individuals who, when confronted with an existential threat, chose to act. To fully appreciate the courage of the Chernobyl divers, it's essential to understand the grim scientific realities they faced. This wasn't a visible enemy they could shoot or outmaneuver. It was an invisible, insidious force that attacked at a cellular level. Radiation, specifically gamma radiation, which can penetrate almost anything, and beta particles, was the primary threat. The molten core, the water, the air, the very debris around them, all were intensely radioactive. Each breath, each drop of water that touched their skin, each second spent in that environment, was a direct assault on their DNA. Acute radiation syndrome, ARS, the medical term for severe radiation poisoning, is a horrific process. Within hours or days of exposure, symptoms like nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, and extreme fatigue set in. But these are just the initial warnings. The real damage occurs internally. The radiation destroys rapidly dividing cells, particularly those in the bone marrow, which are responsible for producing blood cells. This leads to a catastrophic collapse of the immune system, making the body vulnerable to any infection. The gastrointestinal tract is also ravaged, leading to severe internal bleeding and an inability to absorb nutrients. Eventually, The central nervous system can be affected, leading to seizures, delirium, and a slow, agonizing death. The divers were acutely aware of these dangers. They were not ignorant men, they were engineers. They understood the physics, the biology, the almost certain outcome of their mission. Yet, they volunteered. This wasn't a reckless gamble born of ignorance, but a deliberate, informed act of self-sacrifice born of profound duty. They knew the invisible enemy, understood its horrifying power, and still chose to confront it directly. Their bravery was magnified by the nature of the threat: silence. Unlike a battle where the roar of gunfire or the screams of the wounded might provide a measure of the danger, here there was only the incessant, mechanical clicking of the Geiger counters, a clinical, impersonal tally of the invisible killer entering their bodies. This quiet, insidious nature of the enemy perhaps makes their courage even more poignant. They were walking into a silence that spoke volumes of their fate. The threat of the second steam explosion was equally understood in scientific terms. When superheated molten material, like the corium, comes into contact with a large volume of water, a phenomenon called a fuel-coolant interaction, FCI, can occur. This interaction can rapidly convert the water into steam, creating immense pressures. In a confined space like the suppression pools beneath Reactor 4, this would have been a massive overpressure event, a gigantic steam explosion, far more powerful than the initial hydrogen explosions that blew off the reactor lid. The consequences, as Legasov outlined, would have been truly apocalyptic for Europe. The Chernobyl divers stood between humanity and that terrifying physical reality. Beyond the scientific data and the cold calculus of radiation doses, the story of the Chernobyl divers is a profoundly human one. It speaks to the fundamental questions of duty, sacrifice, and the capacity for selflessness in the face of unimaginable horror. These were men from the Soviet Union, a nation often portrayed in the West through the lens of Cold War animosity. Yet, their act transcends ideology. It was a universal act of human courage, a testament to the common thread of self-preservation giving way to a higher purpose, the preservation of others. In a world gripped by nuclear fears, their actions offered a stark, powerful example of individual heroism preventing a global catastrophe. What motivated them? Was it pure patriotism? An ingrained sense of duty to their socialist homeland? A deeply personal moral imperative to protect their families, their neighbors, their fellow citizens? It was likely a complex mixture of all these factors. In the face of a threat so vast, so all-encompassing, the individual distinctions of nation and ideology seemed to fade. What remained was the raw, primal human instinct to protect, to serve, to stand in the breach. Their story also highlights the unique challenges of responding to a nuclear disaster. There were no established protocols for this scale of event. Every decision, from sending in firefighters without protection to these divers descending into the radioactive abyss, was made in real time, under immense pressure, with incomplete information, and with terrifying consequences. The heroism wasn't just in the act, but in the willingness to make those impossible choices. The quiet, almost understated nature of their sacrifice also stands in stark contrast to the often glorified narratives of battlefield heroism. There were no medals pinned on them immediately, no cheering crowds. Just a grim acknowledgement of a job done, a debt paid, and a life forfeited. Their valor lay in their willingness to be anonymous, to accept their fate for the greater good. It is this quiet dignity, this almost monastic acceptance of their mission, that makes their story so compelling and so enduring. They were not celebrated immediately. Their story was initially shrouded in secrecy and misinformation, a casualty of the Soviet system's desperate attempts to control the narrative. Yet, truth, like radiation, eventually seeps out. Their names, once whispered, are now honored. Their sacrifice, once hidden, is now understood as one of the defining moments of the Chernobyl disaster, and indeed, of the 20th century. The Chernobyl disaster was a cataclysm that fundamentally altered the course of human history. It forced a global re-evaluation of nuclear safety, impacted international relations, and left an indelible scar on the Ukrainian landscape and psyche. But within this vast tragedy, there are stories that shine like embers in the dark, stories of extraordinary courage, profound sacrifice, and selfless duty. The story of the three Chernobyl divers, Alexei Ananenko, Valeri Bezpalov, and Boris Baranov, is foremost among them. Their names may not be as universally recognized as those of military generals or political leaders, but their actions secured a victory far greater than any battlefield triumph. They saved millions of lives. They averted a continental catastrophe that would have rendered vast swathes of Europe uninhabitable. They walked into the heart of a nuclear hell, knowing they would not return whole, and they did it for all of us. Their mission was a testament to the fact that even in the most technological of disasters, the human element remains paramount. When robots failed, when remote control systems proved inadequate, it was human courage, human knowledge, and human selflessness that ultimately stood in the breach. It was the ultimate demonstration of man confronting the terrifying forces he himself had unleashed, and choosing, through sheer will, to contain them. Today, the Chernobyl exclusion zone remains a haunting testament to human ambition and its consequences. Nature, in a perverse twist, has begun to reclaim the abandoned city of Pripyat, with trees growing through concrete and wild animals roaming the streets. But deep within the confines of the new safe confinement, beneath the shattered remains of Reactor Number 4, the chilling legacy of the disaster endures. And with it, the inspiring, terrifying, and profoundly heroic memory of the 3 men who walked into the abyss. Their sacrifice was not in vain. It stands as a powerful, eternal reminder that heroism is not always found on the battlefield, but often in the quiet, desperate acts of individuals who choose to put the needs of humanity above their own. The Chernobyl divers, the suicide squad who defied an apocalypse, represent the very best of the human spirit. They are unseen heroes, their legacy a silent, powerful beacon of courage, reminding us of the immense potential for good that resides even in the darkest hours of human history. Their mission was one way, but its impact reverberates through time, a chilling warning and an inspiring testament to profound human valor.